everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an event on the future of free speech with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. My name is Hannah Noor, and I will be your host today. I just want to quickly start off by introducing myself. I am a second-year medical student at the University of Central Florida College of Medicine, and I am also a critical thinking fellow at the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation. As a fellow, I am able to start a conversation on my college campus to advance both freedom and human rights in the US and around the world through an emphasis on nurturing critical thinking. Now, the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation is a nonprofit that works to protect women from honor violence, forced marriage, and genital mutilation with an overall emphasis on liberty for all. Now, this includes working to ensure that free speech is upheld in the face of opposition, censorship, and intimidation. Now, this brings us to today's topic. Freedom of speech is the foundation of our democratic society. It is what allows us to challenge norms, delve into nuance, and foster intellectual growth. However, today, we see many individuals unwilling to engage with differing opinions in the face of political correctness. In the words of John Stuart Mill, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is robbing the human race. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth, produced by its collision with error. And I would like to repeat that last part, produced by its collision with error. Freedom of speech is not just about legal rights. It is also about a culture of shared values and norms that uphold our free society. It is about the exchange of diverse viewpoints that allows us to grow as both individuals and as a society. In today's conversation, we will explore the attack on freedom of speech, the path forward, and how we can work towards a future where a free speech culture is both celebrated and cherished as an essential element of our democratic principles. Now, today, we are joined by the phenomenal Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Our speaker's story began in Somalia in 1969, where as a young girl, she was subjected to female genital mutilation. Upon being forced by her father to marry a distant cousin, she fled to the Netherlands, where she worked her way up from humble beginnings to serving as an elected member of the Dutch Parliament. Her unique experiences allows her to speak on a number of issues related to the fundamentalist Islam and the treatment of women. This led to death threats following the murder of Theo van Gogh. Of all people, Ayaan understands the necessity of speaking truth to power and bringing forth nuance in the face of narratives. She's a woman that does not back down when she sees a problem. And as a public intellectual with a powerful voice, she's well known as a defender of the freedom of speech, both in the US, supporting First Amendment rights, and abroad, advocating for freer dialogue in closed societies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Hannah, thank you very much. And I must say, I met you not only as a fellow of critical thinking here at the AHA Foundation, but as a warrior for free speech. And I admire your courage and thank you once again for undertaking this. So I will just give you 5 minutes to start you off, and I'll start with the big picture, which is the threat to free speech today in general in the world. We live in a globalized world, and I see 3 major threats to the protections of free speech here in the West, and in the frustration of Western efforts to export the idea of free speech. The first major threat is the rise of authoritarian states, of which China is a huge example. China has become this surveillance state, and because of technology invented in the West, but of course exported elsewhere, it has given governments like the Chinese government, but also like Russia, and other authoritarian governments across the world, think about the Middle East, South Asia, Latin America, it has given these authoritarian governments just this incredible amount of power to suppress speech, to spy on individuals, to get them into the fold, and to engage in all sorts of repressive measures that they did in the past, but are so much easier to do on a mass level these days. The second global threat is the rise and spread of various forms of Islamist ideology across the world. Now, in the past, Islamism was advanced by governments. Think about the government of Iran, but also think about the government of Saudi Arabia. It seems to me as if now Saudi Arabia is not really in the business of advancing Islamism, at least not since the Trump administration's intervention, and I think since their understanding that they can't simply rely on oil for the rest of their lives. But nonetheless, Islamism, whether it's promoted by a government or it's not promoted by a government, is on the rise, and it has spread. And it hasn't only spread in the original countries, Muslim majority countries, but it has spread to Europe, and it has spread to America. And it is, and has been for at least 3 decades, in my view, a major threat to the freedom of speech. And then finally, we have this revolution, which I call the woke revolution, which is underway in the West, in America. It's made in the West, and it has spread from out of the universities and university campuses into almost every other institution that you can think of. And it's bottom up. It is not going to the government. I mean, it has eventually come to, but the threat of free speech posed by the woke is not top down. It's not coming from the government. It's not the government that's silencing us, but it's groups of activists who are seeking the help first of the administrative university, and then the administrative government and the administrative agencies of corporations, any kind of institutions, to allow only one kind of opinion. So if you take these 3 forces together, rise of the authoritarian state, which is global, spread of Islamism, the woke revolution, and you put them together, you see a very serious threat to free speech. And I hope we have the chance today to discuss that.
Thank you, Ayaan, for that. Just really quickly, I'm going to explain the format of the remainder of the webinar. I will be asking Ayaan a series of questions, and if we have time left at the end, the audience will be allowed to ask Ayaan a question. And to do that, just go ahead and use the Q&A function in Zoom. All right, so Ayaan, I'm really glad you mentioned Iran. I think originally I wanted to ask you about the women life freedom movement in Iran, and how there was a moment where we saw people in the West willing to engage in a conversation, willing to see how the hijab can be oppressive. Originally, I wanted to ask you if you thought that this trend would continue, if you thought there'd be less backlash and more nuance for criticism of Islamic ideology. However, after October 7th, I think everything has changed. I thought the needle had moved so that fundamentalist Islam would be more subject to criticism, but the outpouring anti-Semitism and sympathy towards Hamas seems to indicate that Islam remains a hands-off subject. Today, where do we stand on Islam in terms of the culture of free speech? And broadly, where do we stand with free speech in the Israel-Palestine discussion?
So that's a very, very broad question, but it does go to the heart of the matter. There is the threat to free speech that is buried in Islamist, it's inherent in Islamist ideology, on the one hand, that seeks to suppress all our opinions that are not advancing the Islamist agenda. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is, how does the world respond to it, and in particular the West? Because it's here in the West that freedom of speech is enshrined in laws and protected. And we can see and have seen that Islamism is a threat to freedom of speech. The way we are responding, just precisely as you described it, the way we responded to the 7th of October atrocities that were committed by Hamas in Israel, the killing of small babies, of grandmothers, the raping of women, just the sheer cruelty and brutality of not just killing people, but torturing them and taking pleasure in the pain. The way we respond to this reminds me of 9/11/2001, when I thought, I mean, you're too young to know this, but I was, I think, just turned 30, 31 years old, and I thought this is the turning point. Now everybody sees the ideology of radical Islam for what it is. We're not going to protect it. We're going to fight it. And again, on the 7th of October, I thought it's very clear now. The Hamas charter makes it very clear what their intentions are. We're not going to make excuses for them. We're going to fight them. And I'm disappointed, just like you, and horrified at the response, which is more appeasement, more accommodation. And I think part of why our response to the 7th of October makes me more uneasy than the way we responded to 9/11/2001 is because of the woke revolution. Because the Islamist, and I think the most active of these Islamist movements is the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is a branch, it's a militant branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think what in the last few decades they did is to infiltrate our institutions, civil rights organizations like the ACLU, every kind of meaning-making institution that we have, an institution of formation of information and knowledge. And they've been able to ride on the backs of the woke and to pretend that they have a common agenda in bringing down, because the woke say they want to bring down the structures of oppression and they want to liberate us from the oppressor. And I think these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, Islamist organizations have piggybacked on that. And we've unfortunately ignored that. And we're now reaping the fruits of this because we are seeing what we would think of as the most privileged students, kids going to Ivy League universities who are supposed to learn how to think, not what to think, come out and make excuses and even celebrate on American campuses the horrors that happened on the 7th of October, 2023. It's mind-boggling.
So many things stuck out from those comments. The first thing that comes to mind is how Islamists have used the term Islamophobia. And of course, I view this term as a total conflation of anti-Muslim bigotry and criticism of an ideology. And it's kind of this thing that, as you said, the woke revolution has taken and run with. A huge example is something like Queers for Palestine.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
I saw something on social media that said chickens for KFC.
Yeah.
And especially as ex-Muslims, you can understand of like expressing your perspective, expressing your experiences and just not being listened to. And I myself, as a gay ex-Muslim, express this, and still people are not always willing to hear this perspective that doesn't line up with a narrative. And one thing that really sticks out to me, and I'd like to hear more from you about it, is kind of compassion breeding cruelty. It's like you see a lot of these individuals, they may be well-intentioned, but they're so far down this line of a paradigm that this is how society defines a good person. I believe I'm a good person, so I believe this.
Yeah.
Where are students heading if this is all that's their paradigm, what they're thinking in their heads?
I think they're heading towards where the Marxists of Iran were left after they collaborated with the Islamists and Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 and his followers, they took control of the government of Iran. And most people don't remember this, but the atheist Marxists who supported and who were brothers in the struggle against the Shah were put in prison, they were killed, they were exiled, and they were completely deprived of power. And I think all of these people who are under the illusion that today, by marching along with those with whom they think they share an agenda, as soon as the Islamists have what they want, they turn on the useful idiots. So for the students who are secular and who may be more, excited about protecting the climate or LGBTQ rights, or who just hate the countries that they were born in and the constitutions, and the people who want to scapegoat Jews. And this is, again, something that hearts and minds on American campuses are filled with this idea of a white oppressor. And very often that white oppressor is presented as the Jew, the state of Israel. So all of these people who are befuddled, by and confused on campus, I think they're going to have a very rude awakening when they discover that they have, in fact, nothing in common with the Islamists. The Islamists have a very clear agenda, and they have rules, and we've seen every time. Remember the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of ISIS. I just mentioned the rise of Khomeini, the Shia version of Islamism. Every time they get power and they get what they want, the first thing that they do is they get rid of those who, as prescribed in their agenda, are considered to be infidels and unbelievers, sinners. As you know, as an ex-Muslim, to be gay is to be a sinner, and it's a sin that deserves the death penalty. So that's exactly what they do. They throw them from tall towers, tall buildings. They behead people who one day were marching with them, and the next day they've been declared infidels. And they have a special hatred for Jews and Jewish people and the state of Israel. And so all of these kids on American campuses, and by the way, on European streets as well, who think that they're marching for the people who are trapped in Gaza, the women and the children, and the victims of this war that was started by Hamas, and that started by Hamas over and over again, I think that they don't understand what the Islamist agenda is. And I hope that they wake up before they are met with the same fate as those people who went along with ISIS and thought that they were working towards utopia.
Yeah, that really makes me think about how free speech has kind of shifted. It's like free speech didn't really matter before, when you see organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, that, like FIRE for short, FIRE, has been talking about this chill and free speech and has been defending students' rights for so long. But now free speech didn't matter until now, until it actually, they were put into the position. Yeah. But at the same time, I'd also like to touch on how in Florida specifically, you see DeSantis putting out an order to de-recognize Students for Justice in Palestine. And FIRE has publicly said that this is unconstitutional and is a threat to free speech, because there was no indication for the chancellor's letter that any action from Florida Students for Justice in Palestine groups went beyond expression of a fully protected by the First Amendment. So I guess where I'm going there with is you kind of see it on both ends, and I'd love to hear more from you about this, of kind of bringing in an authoritarian aspect of like the censorship, but also the importance of being able to have conversations on something like this topic.
I think that if political leaders like DeSantis, but I think Hillary Clinton was also out, and President Biden and a few other people, if they condemn the slogans and the outrageous and criminal behavior and there were people who were marching with the emblems of the paragliders that went and that Hamas people used to get into the kibbutz to slaughter people. I think to condemn that kind of expression as a political leader is in fact an obligation. I think they should do it. And I think DeSantis is right in saying this is terrible and we condemn this. But I don't think that I didn't take him to mean he's actually going to write laws to ban that kind of sloganeering. He cannot in America. We have the First Amendment. No elected political leader, unless he has 2/3 of the majority, unless there is an amendment to the First Amendment, they cannot ban that kind of speech. So we live in a society, we live in an open society where speech that we find offensive, and I find some of this sloganeering that's going in wholly offensive, but still it's protected speech. And I think what you're seeing now is the people who want to take away free speech play that game. They think it's a game. And they say, I can go and say, death to the Jews, kill the Jews, and they can sing Khaybar, Khaybar, you know what that means. And from the river to the sea, basically they're calling out for genocide. They can do that, and now they're claiming that they're exercising their freedom of speech.
Yeah, it's when things go full circle. That's really fascinating to me, and I'm really appreciative of organizations.
Some of these kids, the other day, they were complaining about microaggressions, and they were claiming that speech is violence. And they're out there now in large numbers agitating for the genocide of the Jews and the obliteration of the state of Israel. I don't know what exactly is going on these campuses, but something has to change.
I think it really points to the importance of principles, and again with the organization FIRE, how they have stood firm on this for I believe over 20 years now, despite consistently consistently being called a conservative organization. They have been fighting for free speech for any side. At least we have organizations like this that are willing to stand for free speech, even if indeed that speech is abhorrent. Ayaan, I also want to touch on another element of your past. You grew up in Somalia, in Kenya, in Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, quite a few places. And I was just wondering, would your past experience of living in these tribal societies, where do you think Americans are headed if this polarization continues to rise? In other words, how do you see these current cultural patterns that we have, for instance, on U.S. On U.S. college campuses with your past experience?
I see the tribalism that you are describing, and growing up and living in various tribal societies, I can tell you life is short, it's brutal, it's violent, women are oppressed. It's not fun not to have a free speech or not to have any kinds of freedoms. It is not fun to have the poverty of imagination. It was very hard in Muslim majority countries to invent anything, because sooner or later someone will come shouting, haram, it's forbidden what you're doing. So you really as a society can't advance if you don't have the freedom to think and to be creative and to exercise your critical thinking faculties. Is America headed towards tribalism? On the days that I feel pessimistic, when you get this bad news and the headlines one after the other, I get depressed and I think, yeah, it looks like we're headed for a bad place. But then I see the reaction, for instance, to cancel culture. When our mainstream media goes crazy, then what I find is the rise of Substack and people using the internet to express what they feel, get together, share their frustrations peacefully. You have been to my class at UATX, the University of Austin, Texas. It's only in America that we think, okay, so Harvard is gone down this path, Instead of saying there's no hope, let's close the doors, we say, why don't we start another institution that's much better, that safeguards? And you don't like this business, you start another business. So as long as we have our constitution and we have the markets and we allow, and here's where free speech is key, as long as more people feel that they can be creative, they can be critical, and they can freely associate and create, then I think America is going to be fine and the tribalism is not going to swallow us. But I see what everyone else sees, which is we have all the warning signs of a society that might crumble if we take all the good things that we have for granted. And one good example of taking good things for granted is campuses. We've taken our universities for granted. We always thought, oh, those kids, it's, kids in college, they're annoying. They say these outrageous things. That's what college is for. That's the time you can be outrageous. And we completely neglected what was going on there. Even though some of us saw it, we were ringing the warning bells for some time now. An organization like FIRE has been doing it for a long time. Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind ages ago, but we ignored all of those voices. We ignored all of those Cassandras, and now we're waking up to the fact that our institutions of education and knowledge are rotten and rotting. And I think it is time that we get together honestly and stand up to this and stem the rot and start afresh, or try and reform these institutions. And I hope really that the 7th of October, that was the warning that we needed to wake us up properly and to unify us against the forces of authoritarianism and the forces of religious fanaticism and the forces of wokeism, which is really the quest for naked, unchecked power.
And I really liked how you touched on the factor of taking things for granted, because I will admit I have been in this position. I was born and raised in the United States, and my parents are Moroccan immigrants. So I grew up here. I grew up taking our First Amendment for granted, until I started to reflect on what my experience are like going to Morocco and seeing the difference in life, seeing what's acceptable and not acceptable. That is what made me realize how privileged I am to have been born and raised here, how much opportunity I have, and how appreciative I am to be here. And that's part of what makes me such an adamant defender of free speech. And someone that comes to mind is Enes Kanter, or I should say Freedom Kanter now, the former NBA player who has been such a staunch, what's the word? He has definitely spoken out against human rights violations across the world, and he's lost his job at the NBA for it. And there's this story that he tells of when he came to the United States, of he was in a locker room with his teammates, and his teammates were making fun of the president, and he's like, hey guys, you can't do that, that's not okay, or you're going to get in trouble. And his teammates turn to him and they're like, no dude, this is the United States, we can say whatever. And I kind of had that reverse experience of being in Morocco and saying whatever, and then realizing that you cannot say whatever about the king in Morocco. That's unacceptable. And that kind of pushed me towards understanding the importance of freedom of speech. And I really love that you touched on Substack and University of Austin, UATX. I know you're a founding faculty member, and I myself am part of the student advisory board. And this is another thing that I wanted to touch on, because you see Substack, UATX, you see Barry Weiss's The Free Press. And
along with FIRE.
Along with FIRE.
And FAIR.
And FAIR. And I'm wondering, in order to uphold the principles of freedom of expression, is it possible to reform existing institutions, or is creating new ones the only way forward?
I think both. We need to create new institutions and show them UATX has to succeed. And to show that, we can do it. But I also think that we can reform existing institutions. There just has to be the collective will to do it. And I think for too long we've been distracted. I was very happy with some of the donors who, right after these campus students came out in Harvard and signed that atrocious paper, who said, fine, we're not going to, give money, donate to Harvard anymore. And I think if you get leadership like that, where the donors come together and say, first of all, what's going on inside these campuses? Let's do an audit of some of these so-called courses that are being taught, which are really indoctrination exercises. Kids are being brainwashed into believing in certain things that we want. I think you can achieve something with an audit like that, and then hold the adults, the faculty, the administrators that we entrust with educating these young minds. I think it is time to confront them and ask them, what is it that they're doing on these campuses, and why is this outcome happening? Because some of these kids, they look like they're steeped in this stuff, and they really believe it, and they're being really sincere. They're in their impressionable ages. And there must be adults who have to answer for that. We have to hold these people responsible. So I think that they can be reformed, but there has to be that collective will to do it. And there has to be that collective unity to do it, to see why not doing some, not reforming, what's the alternative? Not reforming these institutions is really taking us to darkness at a fast pace.
Something that sticks out is the idea of the collective will to do this. And I think a common thing that I've seen amongst my peers is that they kind of agree that something's not right, that we are regressing in some factors when it comes to this woke revolution, but they're just not willing to speak up on it. I can respect their views, to each their own, but this is something I consistently see of, I totally agree with you. I was 100% feeling the same way, but it's not worth it because I need to get this job. I really want to get this job. And I'm just curious, what response do you have to individuals who express this concern on the chill, on free expression, but choose not to speak out due to worries of cancel?
I think because the cancel culture is real, people lose their jobs, people lose friendships, people get mocked on social media, people get smeared, people also get framed, and they find themselves, lots of litigation against them. They don't have the money, they don't have, and people watch those people who are canceled and the pain and discomfort they're going through, and they think, well, I'm just going to look away and focus on getting my A's, and then I'll go find a job somewhere in Wall Street or Silicon Valley and get on with it. And it's understandable. All of that's understandable. But I think we're now at a place where we're really facing real hardship. I don't want to call it a war yet, but we are facing these forces, the authoritarian force, the spread of radical Islam, this woke revolution. It's all coming together. And I think now is the time to stand up, because if not now, then when? It's going to get harder and harder. And as you can see, the methods of silencing and canceling are becoming more and more brazen, more and more brutal, and they're becoming more organized. They have more money. They have now got individuals in all sorts of institutions, in places of leadership. So the time to speak out collectively and get there, that is now.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I understand what they're feeling. I feel it too. I will definitely admit that. But to me, speaking out is, if we all did the same thing, we wouldn't progress. If we all were afraid of speaking out, we wouldn't progress. So I totally see.
But also think about it. We inherited all of these freedoms because there were people who fought and died for these things. People died to protect, to gain protection for the freedom of speech. to gain protection, for women to gain the right to vote. People died for these things. People died to stop child labor. There's so many things that we have now and we take for granted. We haven't fought for any of it. In fact, if you compare us to prior generations, it's so much easier for us now than when people were being sent to the trenches in the First and Second World Wars, and beyond. So it's sometimes, I think we have to straighten our priorities and know that maybe you will get that job now and you'll advance that career, but maybe a decade from now, there'll be no point in a career because, I don't know, authoritarianism will advance. Will be so constrained and constricted that you might think, I wish I had done something when this was possible.
Yeah, absolutely. When you factor in that there was the people, as you said, people died for the rights that we have today. And with the United States having the most comprehensive free speech protections in the world, it's amazing that people are just taking them for granted. And something that I want to touch on is the emergence of postmodernism, critical theory, the Marcusean repressive tolerance, all that, whichever term is preferred, has essentially led to this chill on free expression, this chill on freedom of speech. And with the US cultural hegemony in mind, if free speech culture continues to dwindle here, what does this mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think that it's for the rest of humanity, because Western culture really is a culture of humanity. It's the most humane culture. Not only were human rights first articulated in the West, but the West also went to great lengths to protect those rights, not only for Westerners, but for everyone else, try to advance it and continue to advance it. And so if that disappears in the West, you can imagine that, we'll be going back to a time of darkness with advanced technologies. So it's not, I think a future without free speech is a dark future. And I think we've had a taste of it on the 7th of October, just now. You've seen how barbaric and brutal those people were, and in the acts, and that is a culture that is not, that's inhumane, that is, in my view, not civilized. You don't have to imagine it, because they've taken videotapes of what they were doing and they put it out there on social media. So we don't have to imagine what the future will look like if people like that take control. We also don't want to imagine, we don't have to imagine what the future will look like if China or China-style authoritarianism gets hold, because barely anyone talks about the Uyghurs. All these people who are on campuses and demonstrating in Washington and protesting in Europe, and by 100,000 strong every weekend in the UK, apparently. Those people are not demonstrating for the Uyghurs. There's 10 million Muslims that are interned in China, denied their rights, women sterilized, forced labor, people disappeared and killed. None of that. Do you see any kind of protests and marching for that kind of thing? But what it tells you is, if American power declines and disappears, that's what things will look like. Between Hamas and the CCP, and then for the woke, you know what they have in store for you, because you share a campus with them. And you know that there is this silencing, and at a certain point, these pressures of silencing people will turn violent. We've also seen the violence manifest itself in Antifa type organizations and Antifa protests. So it's going to be brutal and dark, and it's going to be, a survival of the fittest, very Darwinian, if we don't stand up for what we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you saw I mentioned Ennis or Freedom Cantor earlier, and look what he did. He advocated for the Uyghurs, and the NBA wasn't too happy about that since they're monetarily involved with China.
Yeah.
And at least as a light of hope, I will say that at my campus, I feel like my classmates are at least willing to have a discussion. And I am actively trying to promote a free speech culture by a club that I co-founded with my classmate called the Medical Ethics Forum. And we have already been able to have great civil discussions on COVID protocols and even abortion. Abortion was such a civil conversation with such diversity of thought. So at least in my environment, I'm starting to see hope. And I would really hope that people start, as you said, start speaking out and having open conversations and agreeing to disagree. One thing that I did wanted to mention that I was absolutely fascinated by, and I would love for you to comment on, was when Kamala Harris announced, forgot the exact terminology, but the Islamophobia, I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but the White House essentially came out against Islamophobia, and I'd like to comment a little bit on that.
So I think what I'm seeing within the Democratic Party is, when I came to the United States, the senior people of the Democratic Party were people like Hillary Clinton. Now, you may disagree with some of her politics, you may agree with it, but that was center left, it was sane, it was, as far as I'm concerned, patriotic, pro-American, but also pro-Israel, and it was principled. And then along came, after 2016, Bernie Sanders brought in the progressives. And by the way, he wasn't a Democrat, he was an independent who infiltrated the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is split in two now. There is the so-called progressive wing, or not progressive, but really very regressive and woke. And then there is the older group, Kamala Harris, Biden, Governor Hochul of New York, and they really don't understand. There is a big void between these two groups, and I think they're clashing now. And the radical Islamist movement, many of them of the Muslim Brotherhood branches, they infiltrated the Democratic Party and insinuated themselves into all sorts of places, Democratic media, Democratic Party, Democratic, also where gatherings where they come. And now I think what we're seeing is this, people like Kamala Harris first being told, you've got to say this, because it fits in with the identity politics that the Democratic Party has adopted. But then confronted by the reality after October 7, and I think this confusion inside the party is apparent in things like this, where I don't think Kamala Harris knows what Islamophobia is. I don't think she paid any attention to it. I don't think she knows where it comes from. But I think her gut instinct is to support Israel, because A, she's married to a Jewish man, but B, it's also the Democratic Party is strongly pro-Israel, the older generation, and she belongs with that older generation. And so she comes around now and, first says this and then has to unsay it. But my position now is, I don't think we need any more polarization. Right now, we need unity. One of the things that I learned from the 7th of October immediately was Israelis were so divided and so focused on their internal divisions that they lost sight of the enemy that wants to obliterate all of them. And I think in America, we need to do the same. We need to come away from these internal issues that divide us and get together and see the external enemy and these external forces. So I'm not going to criticize Kamala Harris. Biden is our commander-in-chief. And right now, in this situation of urgency, I think we just have to stand behind people who are in our government when they're doing the right thing. And right now, they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I just want to be clear about what I was asking before. What I was mentioning is how Kamala Harris announced the country's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And do you think that, I feel like when it comes to us not trying to head towards being more polarized,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily see that helps. And now at the end of the day, I know that they're trying to use Islamophobia in these terms as anti-Muslim bigotry, and that's abhorrent, and people should not be judged, people should not be discriminated against for their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the number of hate crimes, of actual physical violence that have been committed recently, anti-Semitism has definitely been blown. The proportions of anti-Semitism within the United States compared to anti-Muslim bigotry do not even compare. And I kind of, and you can talk more about this, I kind of see the national strategy to counter Islamophobia more as potentially dividing people even more. And
Yeah. I think we have to keep going back to the problems that are going on campuses, which is people are not getting educated. Anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred. Jews are hated for no other reason than just being Jews. They're blamed for every blight in the world. And you compare that to Islamophobia, a word that was conveniently invented in the 1990s, that is, Muslims are not hated just because they are Muslim. People don't fear Muslims just because they are Muslim. There is a context, yes, because of some of these events that are going on, individual Muslims meet with anti-Muslim bigotry. That's a fact. You see it all the time, but it cannot be compared to, there is absolutely no equivalence with anti-Semitism. There's been no anti-Muslim Holocaust. There hasn't been genocides like that simply because people were Muslim or because of their faith. And we have to remember that 1.5 billion people in the world, some people say 1.9 billion people in the world, are Muslim, and they're of all ethnicities and all skin colors, and they live all over the world. And that's not to be compared with the 9 million or so Jewish people and the struggle that is ongoing to maintain and preserve a homeland for all of those victims of anti-Semitism over centuries, a place to call home, and that's what they've been denied. I think you can't compare these things, and we are making these stupid comparisons. On the one hand, the woke are doing it on purpose, and on the other hand, people are being so gullible as to be drawn into this because they're not getting educated.
yes, absolutely. And that kind of reminds me of the NYU students ripping down posters of the Israeli hostages, and how this wasn't just limited to NYU. This was also, I believe, in Britain. And what it makes me think of, bringing it back to the topic of campuses, how can students actually communicate across these such intense divisions? How can we move forward, and how can we have more nuanced and meaningful discussions on this interpersonal level?
You were in my critical thinking class. It's by holding exercises where you have students on both sides of the argument and you insist on rules of civility, be no violence, no verbal abuse. We're just going to argue and exchange ideas and perspectives. And you're going to have to do these exercises so you can argue through all the different steps. What if you're in the position of Israel and there is a demand for a ceasefire, and how complicated it is to have women and children and other civilians where, missiles are landing. What the other side says, but that's where they're hiding, and that's where they're throwing the missiles from. And as a student, you engage in these exercises, and as you're engaging in it, you're learning to think, not what to think. The point of the exercise is not to get to a conclusion, but the point of the exercise is to learn how to think, so that you know how to think in different situations and how to lead. And another demand would be to read about the past and what happened and why these things came about the way they did. And that's not what's happening on campuses, apparently. Apparently, campuses have become, you don't have a professor who teaches you how to think. You have an activist in front of the class who's telling you what to think and is asking you to advance an agenda. And that's not what campuses were for.
Yes, absolutely. And that brings us to our audience questions. I think we have time for one. So this kind of falls in line with this question of having meaningful discussions. So Janelle H is asking, as a Jewish woman, I'm finding it very difficult to express my concerns for Jewish people when so many Palestinians are recklessly losing their lives. I agree that Hamas is the root of the problem. However, Israel is complicit as their occupation continues, and Palestinians cannot live in peace because of this occupation, nor can they live in peace because of Hamas. How does one respectfully convey their sentiments in regards to this war?
I think the first step is to educate oneself. It's, yes, a very complicated matter, but at first, as you were reading this, I was thinking, but Gaza wasn't occupied. Gaza was under the control of Hamas, and the people of Gaza elected Hamas to be their government. Many of them regretted that. And Hamas has a charter that says they have absolutely no intention of having Israel or dividing the state or living in peace. They want the state of Israel gone. With that attitude, with an enemy like that, because the rational thing to do would be to have the Israelis and Palestinians go back to the table and come up with a two-state solution, brokered by America, brokered by members of the international community. That would be the rational thing to do. But Hamas sabotages this. There was a normalization of relations between Arab nations and Israel underway. Hamas did this on the 7th of October to sabotage that. So I think as long as Hamas is in the picture, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians is not going to be in sight. And I agree with Netanyahu and the Israeli government that the first order of the day is to get them out of the way. And once that happens, and it's going to be very painful because they're going to resist, but I think once that's done, then it is conceivable to have a normalization of relations between Arabs and Jews in general, and a two-state peace solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
For that. Now, Elizabeth F. also asks, Ayaan, do you have any friends, in parentheses, as I do, who say they are joining pro-Palestinian rallies or speaking out for Palestine simply on behalf of ordinary Palestinians, that they are rallying for Hamas and what it did and not cheering on Hamas? Their perception of their side is merely as wanting to protect innocent Palestinian women and children. What do you say to them?
I remind them, I show them the Hamas charter, I read it loudly to them. I say to them, put yourself in the shoes of the people on the other side. What would you do if, I live in California, if 1,400 women, children, all women, babies were beheaded by an entity coming across from Mexico, what would we do? And I say to my European friends, what if your neighboring country did that, or an entity, non-governmental entity within that neighboring country? What would you do? Let's think seriously about this. And when I look at the children and the women and the elderly and male civilians who are not interested in this in Gaza, I think it's Hamas that has put them in that position. They build their rockets in schools, in hospitals, in nursery schools, in homes, shops, mosques. That's where they put, and that's where they're launching the missiles from. How do you deal with an enemy that has zero respect for human life, even their own human life? The people that they say that they're fighting for, Hamas is not really fighting for human beings called Palestinians to have a state of their own. They have this utopian agenda, this religious fanaticism, that they think that the only thing that we have to do is eradicate the state of Israel, and then we'll go to heaven. That's what they think. It's not about the people for them, and the people are suffering. And so for anybody who thinks of the interests of the Palestinians and the interests of the Jewish people and human beings in general, organizations, the mindsets of Hamas has to be dealt with, and it has to be confronted. Until that's done, babies will continue to die on either side.
Thank you for that, Ayaan. I think we have time for one more question. This one's going to be from Jerome B. He says, hi, what do you think would be the single most effective way to wrest power away from the woke movement?
Wake up. Wake up and organize and read and understand. Go to James Lindsay's website. He has sort of an ABC of what is woke for dummies. Start there. Once you understand what they're after, which is naked power, organize. Organize in your school boards, organize in your neighborhoods, organize in your jobs, the organization that you work for, in your sports clubs, in your cultural clubs, and stand up to them. And this is what I hear, Hannah, most of the time. I think when you were asking me a question, you said the same thing. In any given context, something woke is imposed on the rest of us. For instance, this ritual of saying that we are on stolen land, and we go along with it. Most people will murmur silently and say that's ridiculous, but they won't say anything. And I think it's in those contexts that you stand up and you say, no, that's absolutely ridiculous. We're not on stolen land. And you make your point and you say, that's what you think. It's not what we think. And you're wasting our time, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's when I think I have to stop now.
All right, Ayaan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure everyone absolutely learned something from you. And thank you everyone for joining us and helping us defend the bedrock of our democratic society. So thank you.